Part 1. The largest naval battle in the history of the world was fought over 4 days in the waters around a Philippine island called Leyte between the 23rd and the 26th of October, 1944. 200,000 men fought in it. 367 warships fought in it. 1,800 aircraft fought in it. By the time it ended, on the evening of the 26th of October, 28 Japanese warships had gone to the bottom of the Pacific. 6 American ships had gone with them. 12,500 Japanese sailors were dead. 1,500 Americans were dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had begun the war on the 7th of December, 1941, by launching 6 aircraft carriers against Pearl Harbor, ceased to exist as a fighting force capable of offensive operations. This is the story of how that happened. It began on the afternoon of the 20th of October, 1944, on a beach on the eastern coast of the island of Leyte, in a shallow surf that came to about the knees of a 64-year-old American general. His name was Douglas MacArthur. 2.5 years earlier, in March of 1942, on the orders of President Franklin Roosevelt, MacArthur had left the island fortress of Corregidor in Manila Bay under cover of darkness aboard a PT boat, abandoning the American and Filipino forces still fighting on the Bataan Peninsula. He had made his way to Australia. He had made a promise to the people of the Philippines. 3 words: I shall return. For 32 months, that promise had been printed on leaflets dropped by American submarines onto Philippine beaches, spoken over shortwave radio broadcasts from Australia, and repeated in every speech Douglas MacArthur gave to any audience on any continent. On the 20th of October, 1944, at approximately 13:30 in the afternoon, wearing a freshly pressed uniform that had been changed on the transport ship an hour earlier, holding a Filipino aide's pistol at his hip because his own weapons had been packed into a footlocker, General Douglas MacArthur stepped off a Higgins boat into knee-deep water on Red Beach at Palo, on the eastern coast of Leyte. Waded ashore. He kept his uniform above the water. Cameras filmed him. Newsreel crews recorded him. He walked up onto the sand. Someone put a microphone in front of him, spoke into it. People of the Philippines, he said, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil. That is what happened on the beach on the 20th of October, 1944. It was one of the most famous moments of the Second World War. And what MacArthur did not know, standing on that beach, in front of those cameras, with his freshly pressed uniform and his pistol on his hip, was that 1,500 kilometers to the west of him, in a headquarters in Kure, Japan, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, Admiral Soamu Toyoda, had already given the order that was going to send the entire remaining strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy against him. The order was called Sho-Ichi-Go. It translates as Victory Operation Number 1. It was the last coordinated offensive operation the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever launch. It was designed to destroy the American fleet supporting the Leyte landings, and by destroying that fleet, to strand MacArthur's soldiers on the beach where he had just waded ashore, and by stranding them there, forced the United States to negotiate a peace short of unconditional surrender. It was, in every sense that mattered by the autumn of 1944, Japan's last card. The plan had 4 moving parts. The first part was Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, 58 years old, commanding what remained of the Japanese carrier fleet. 4 aircraft carriers, 2 hybrid battleship carriers, almost no aircraft. Turnus Turkey shoot in June of 1944 had killed most of the pilots the Japanese Navy had left, and the replacements were not ready. Ozawa's mission was to serve as a decoy. He was to take his empty carriers north of the Philippines, make himself visible to American reconnaissance, and draw the American Third Fleet under Admiral William Halsey away from the invasion beaches. Ozawa knew this. He knew, before he sailed, that his ships would probably not survive. He accepted the mission anyway. The second part was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, 55 years old, commanding the main strike force. 5 battleships, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, with their 18.1-inch guns, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers. Kurita's mission was to transit the San Bernardino Strait to the north of the island of Samar, come south along the eastern coast of the Philippines, and destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf on the morning of the 25th of October. The third part was Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima, 54 years old, commanding a supporting force of 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers. He was to follow behind the 4th force and support it in transit through the southern strait. The fourth part was Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, 54 years old, commanding the southern force. 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers. His mission was to transit the Surigao Strait to the south of the island of Leyte, come north from the opposite direction, and link up with Kurita's force at Leyte Gulf at dawn on the 25th of October, forming a pincer that would trap and destroy the American landing forces between them. The plan required, absolutely, that the American fleet be too weakened to prevent it. The plan required that the American aircraft carriers, most of which had been operating off Formosa in the middle of October, had been substantially destroyed there. The report that had reached Combined Fleet Headquarters said that 11 American aircraft carriers had been sunk off Formosa. The report was wrong. The actual number was 0. But nobody in Tokyo on the 20th of October 1944 knew the report was wrong. Plan went forward. The American forces waiting for it were divided into 2 separate fleets under 2 separate commanders reporting to 2 separate command structures. Third Fleet was commanded by Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr., 62 years old, of Elizabeth, New Jersey. He reported directly to Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters in Pearl Harbor. His mission was to conduct offensive operations against the Japanese Navy and to protect the American landing forces from any Japanese fleet that came out to interfere with them. The tactical strike arm of the Third Fleet was Task Force 38, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitcher, 57 years old, of Hillsboro, Wisconsin. 17 aircraft carriers, 6 fast battleships, almost 1,500 aircraft. The 7th Fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Thomas Casson Kincaid, 56 years old, of Hanover, New Hampshire. Kincaid did not report to Nimitz. Kincaid reported to General Douglas MacArthur. 7th Fleet included the old battleships that had been salvaged from the mud of Pearl Harbor and rebuilt. They were under Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf, 57 years old, of Riverside, New Jersey. 7th Fleet also included the escort carriers that were providing close air support for the landing forces on the beach. They were under Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague, 48 years old, of Dorchester, Massachusetts. His subordinates called him Ziggy. There were 3 groups of escort carriers. They were called Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Sprague commanded Taffy 3. The critical flaw in the American command structure was this. Halsey reported to Nimitz in Pearl Harbor. Kincaid reported to MacArthur in Australia. Any communication between them had to be relayed through their separate headquarters. Any coordination between them depended on their willingness to coordinate. There was no single naval commander in the theater with authority over both fleets. For the first 3 years of the Pacific War, this arrangement had not mattered. On the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, it would matter more than any single command decision made in the entire war. Because on that morning, in the darkness before dawn, an admiral named Bull Halsey was going to take every ship of his Third Fleet 400 nautical miles to the north, chasing an empty decoy fleet, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded, and Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, with the super battleship Yamato at its head, was going to come through that unguarded strait at 0658 in the morning and find, waiting for it, 6 thin-skinned escort carriers under Ziggy Sprague with 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts as their only protection. 2 hours that followed that discovery would produce the Medal of Honor for a Cherokee Creek Marine officer named Ernest Evans, would produce the deepest shipwreck ever discovered on planet Earth, USS Samuel B. Roberts, located in 2022 at a depth of 6,895 meters, would produce at 10:47 that same morning the first officially organized kamikaze attack in the history of warfare, and would produce the withdrawal of Kurita's center force at 0925. Still short of Leyte Gulf, based on false reports his own ships had sent him claiming that he had sunk American aircraft carriers he had not sunk, ending the last offensive operation of the Imperial Japanese Navy without accomplishing its objective. All of that was 72 hours away from the moment when Douglas MacArthur stepped off the Higgins boat into the shallow surf on Red Beach at Palau. Before any of it could happen, 3 other things had to happen first. First thing was that at dawn on the 23rd of October, 1944, in the deep water between the islands of Palawan and Busuanga in the western Philippines, 2 American submarines named USS Darter and USS Dace made contact with Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force as it transited the Palawan Passage on its way towards San Bernardino Strait. Darter's commanding officer was Commander David McClintock, 36 years old. Dace's was Commander Bladden Claggett, 32 years old. They had been patrolling the Palawan Passage for weeks. They had radioed contact reports back to Pearl Harbor. And at 0532 on the morning of the 23rd, both submarines fired torpedoes into the Japanese formation from ranges of less than 1,000 yards. Darter's torpedoes struck the heavy cruiser Atago, which was Kurita's flagship. Atago went down in 18 minutes. Kurita went into the water as she sank. He was pulled out of the water approximately 30 minutes later by a destroyer named Kishinami. He was transferred to the battleship Yamato later that day. He resumed command of the center force from Yamato. The heavy cruiser Maya, sailing next to Atago in the same formation, was struck by Darter's torpedoes as well. Maya blew up. She sank in 4 minutes with the loss of almost every man aboard. Dace's torpedoes struck the heavy cruiser Takao. Takao did not sink, but she was damaged badly enough that she had to turn back to Brunei, escorted by 2 destroyers. In the first 30 minutes of the 23rd of October, before Vice Admiral Kurita's center force had come anywhere near the Philippines, Kurita had lost 2 heavy cruisers and had lost the use of a 3rd and had lost his flagship and had spent 30 minutes swimming in the South China Sea in his uniform in the pre-dawn darkness. It was a bad omen. The second thing that had to happen was that at 1900 hours on the evening of the 19th of October in Manila, in the headquarters of the 1st Air Fleet at Nichols Field, a 53-year-old Japanese vice admiral named Takejiro Onishi held a meeting with the surviving pilots and squadron commanders of the Naval Air Arm in the Philippines. Onishi had arrived in Manila only 2 days earlier to take command. What he had found when he arrived was that the 1st Air Fleet, on paper responsible for the air defense of the entire Philippines, had approximately 40 serviceable aircraft, not 400, 40. He knew what was coming. He knew about Sho-Ichi-Go. He knew that Kurita's center force and Nishimura's southern force were both going to converge on Leyte Gulf on the morning of the 25th of October. He knew that if American aircraft carriers were operating in support of the landings, they would destroy Kurita and Nishimura before either force could reach the beach. He had 40 aircraft to prevent that. He needed a way to make 40 aircraft accomplish what 1,000 aircraft would have been asked to accomplish 6 months earlier. At the meeting on the evening of the 19th of October, in a room at Nichols Field, in front of the surviving pilots and squadron commanders of the 1st Air Fleet, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed a solution. The solution was that pilots would deliberately crash their aircraft, loaded with a single bomb, into the flight decks of American aircraft carriers. Pilots would not attempt to bomb the carriers and return. They would fly the aircraft into the ship. They would die on impact. The name given to the units that would carry out these attacks was Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Special Attack Corps. The name given in Japanese to what they would do was kamikaze, divine wind. It was a reference to the typhoons that had in the 13th century twice destroyed Mongol invasion fleets attempting to land on Japan. The first kamikaze unit was formed the next day, the 20th of October, at Mabalacat Airfield on Luzon. The officer chosen to lead its first mission was a 23-year-old Naval Academy graduate named Lieutenant Yukio Seki. Seki had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1941 in the same class that had provided many of the pilots who had died at Midway and the Marianas Turkey Shoot. He had been married 4 months. His wife's name was Mariko Watanabe. He had married her in June of 1944, just before receiving his orders to the Philippines. On the evening of the 24th of October, one night before his mission, at the airfield at Mabalacat, Lieutenant Seki gave an interview to a Japanese naval correspondent named Koji Ono. The interview was preserved in a book published in 1958 by Vice Admiral Rikihei Inoguchi, who had been Onishi's chief of staff. In the interview, Seki said that he was not going for the emperor. He was not going for the empire. He said that Japan's future was bleak if it was forced to send its best pilots to die this way. And he said that he was going, in the end, only for his wife. The third thing that had to happen was that Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura had to accept command of the Southern Force and had to lead it into the Surigao Strait on the morning of the 25th of October, knowing what would be waiting for him there. Nishimura was 54 years old. He had been born in November of 1889 in Akita Prefecture, on the northern coast of the Japanese main island of Honshu. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1911. His son, Ensign Teiji Nishimura, had followed him into the Navy. Teiji had become a naval aviator. Teiji had been killed in action in the Philippines in 1942. Nishimura had never publicly spoken about his son's death. Staff officers who worked with him in the years afterward described a man who had become quiet, not distant, quiet. He did his job. He gave his orders. He did not mention his son. Japanese naval accounts written after the war described Nishimura in October of 1944 as a grieving father who had accepted the suicidal mission assigned to him with the calm resignation of a man who believed he was going to the same place his son had already gone. He entered the mouth of the Surigao Strait at approximately 2300 hours on the night of the 24th of October, 1944. The letter he had left with a staff officer who had transferred to a different ship, which is how the letter survived, said that he had received his orders and that the plan required him to go where he was going and that the path was clear. He knew when he entered the strait that the plan he was executing had been built on false intelligence. He knew that his son's spirit was somewhere in those Philippine waters. He entered the strait anyway. That is where this story really begins. Part 2. To understand what happened in the 4 days between the 23rd and the 26th of October 1944, you have to understand the geography of the waters in which it happened. The Philippine archipelago consists of over 7,000 islands. Most of them are small. Some of them are so small they do not have names on maps. The largest of the islands are Luzon in the north, Mindanao in the south, and a scatter of medium-sized islands in the middle called the Visayas, of which the most important for our purposes are Samar in the east, Leyte in the center, and Cebu and Panay to the west. The waters between and around these islands are what the sailors call restricted waters. They are not open ocean. They are narrow channels between land masses, deep in some places and shallow in others, with currents that can run at 8 or 10 knots and reefs that can tear the bottom out of a battleship. And only certain routes that a warship of any significant size can actually take through them. For a Japanese fleet trying to reach the American landing beaches on the eastern coast of Leyte from bases in Borneo or the home islands, there were only 2 viable routes. first route was to the north. It went through a narrow body of water called the San Bernardino Strait, between the southern tip of Luzon and the northern tip of Samar. The San Bernardino Strait is approximately 12 nautical miles long and, at its narrowest, only about 3 nautical miles wide. The current runs at 8 to 10 knots through the strait itself. The channel is deep enough for battleships, but only along one specific route. There is no way to pass through the San Bernardino Strait in daylight without being seen by every coast watcher and every reconnaissance aircraft in the region. That was Kurita's route. The second route was to the south. It went through a channel called the Surigao Strait, between the southern tip of Leyte and the northern tip of Mindanao. The Surigao Strait is approximately 20 nautical miles long and at its narrowest, about 12 nautical miles wide. It is deep. The channel is straight, but it opens at its northern end into Leyte Gulf, which was, on the night of the 24th of October, 1944, the location of the entire American landing fleet. That was Nishimura's route. There was no third route. Battleship trying to reach Leyte Gulf from the west had to go through one of those two straits. There was no way around them. There was no way to hide inside them. There was no way to maneuver inside them. Battleship inside the Surigao Strait was on rails. The Americans understood this geography perfectly. They understood it because it was the same geography that Admiral Yamato had considered when he had planned his own operations against the Philippines in 1941, and the American codebreakers at Nimitz's headquarters had been reading Yamamoto's operational foctemos for years. They knew what Kurita and Nishimura were going to do because there was almost nothing else Kurita and Nishimura could do. 2 ways in were known. The choke points were known. The times of arrival could be predicted within a few hours. The only variable from the American side was whether the American commanders responsible for guarding those 2 choke points would actually guard them. The southern choke point, the Surigao Strait, was the responsibility of Vice Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet. Kinkaid handed the tactical execution to Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, whose Task Group 77.2 consisted of 6 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 28 destroyers, plus 39 PT boats. Oldendorf had spent his entire career learning gunnery. He had been at Pearl Harbor. He had commanded destroyer squadrons. By October of 1944, he was one of the most experienced surface warfare officers in the United States Navy. He looked at the geography of the Surigao Strait. He looked at the intelligence reports Nishimura's approached. He looked at the ships he had available, and he arranged those ships in what naval officers had called, since the 17th century, the classical crossing of the T. Maneuver works like this. A defending fleet forms a line perpendicular to the direction from which the enemy is approaching. As the enemy approaches, only his forward guns can bear on the defender, but the defender's entire broadside can bear on the enemy. The defender delivers many times the firepower the attacker can return. It requires that the attacker approach through a narrow channel where he cannot deploy laterally. It requires that the defender knows where the attacker is coming from and when. The Surigao Strait met both of those conditions. Nishimura was coming north through a channel where he could not maneuver. Oldendorf was waiting for him at the northern exit with 6 battleships and 8 cruisers and 28 destroyers spread across the entire width of the strait in a line that stretched from Leyte to Dinagat Island. Of Oldendorf's 6 battleships, 5 had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, and rebuilt. USS West Virginia, sunk, salvaged, rebuilt with new fire control radar. USS California, sunk, salvaged, Tennessee, damaged, repaired. USS Maryland, damaged, repaired. USS Pennsylvania, damaged, repaired. Only USS Mississippi had not been at Pearl Harbor. Every man aboard those 5 battleships knew exactly where his ship had been on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941. Every one of them knew on the night of the 24th of October, 1944, that they were about to be given the chance to shoot at a Japanese battleship for the first time since Pearl Harbor. The northern choke point, the San Bernardino Strait, was different. San Bernardino Strait was the responsibility of Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet. Halsey did not report to Kinkaid. Halsey reported to Nimitz. Halsey had been given standing orders that included a specific paragraph in the operational directive from Nimitz that said that if a major portion of the Japanese fleet appeared, the destruction of that fleet was to become the primary task. Halsey had read that paragraph. He had underlined it. He believed, when he read it, that it meant that if the Japanese carrier fleet came out to fight, he was to go and fight it no matter what else was happening. He was not wrong to believe that. But there was another sentence in the same order, elsewhere in the paragraph, that said that the covering and support of the 7th Fleet operations against Leyte was also a primary task. Halsey did not underline that sentence. On the afternoon of the 24th of October, 1944, Halsey's carrier aircraft attacked Kurita's center force as it transited the Philippine Sea, approaching San Bernardino Strait. The attacks lasted for approximately 5 hours. The main target was the super battleship Musashi, which was the sister ship of Yamato and one of the 2 largest battleships ever built by any navy. Musashi received, over the course of those 5 hours, approximately 19 bomb hits and 17 torpedo hits, according to some estimates, though the exact number is debated in different sources. The exact number does not matter. What matters is that at 19:35, on the evening of the 24th of October, 1944, in the middle of the Philippine Sea, the super battleship Musashi capsized to port and sank with 1,023 of her crew. She was the first Yamato-class battleship destroyed in the war. She would not be the last. But Halsey, receiving reports of the damage he had done to the Musashi and to the other ships of the center force, drew a conclusion that would prove catastrophic. He concluded that Kurita's center force had been so badly damaged that it had turned back. He was wrong. Kurita's center force had briefly reversed course in the middle of the afternoon to open the range from Halsey's aircraft. But by nightfall, on the 24th of October, Kurita had turned east again, and his surviving battleships and cruisers were once again headed for the San Bernardino Strait. At approximately 18:30, on the evening of the 24th of October, Halsey received a reconnaissance report that Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force had been located approximately 400 nautical miles to the north of Halsey's position. Halsey did not know that Ozawa's carriers were empty. He did not know Ozawa's mission was to serve as a decoy. He knew only that a Japanese carrier force had appeared where no Japanese carrier force had appeared for months. At approximately 2000 on the evening of the 24th of October, Admiral William Halsey composed a message. The message said that he was taking his entire 3rd Fleet to the north at high speed to engage Ozawa's carriers at dawn. He sent the message to Kinkaid. He sent the message to Nimitz. The message used the phrase entire fleet. Kinkaid, receiving the message aboard his flagship in Leyte Gulf, read it, interpreted it, assumed that Halsey had left a fast battleship task force to cover the San Bernardino Strait because no rational commander would take his entire fleet away from an unguarded strait through which the main strength of the Japanese Navy might come. Kinkaid was wrong. Nimitz, receiving the message in Pearl Harbor, read it, interpreted it, made the same assumption Kinkaid had made. Nimitz was also wrong. The San Bernardino Strait was unguarded. At 2200, on the evening of the 24th of October, in the darkness of the Philippine Sea, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force resumed its course toward the San Bernardino Strait. At approximately 0300 on the morning of the 25th of October, unopposed and unobserved, Kurita's center force emerged from the eastern end of the San Bernardino Strait into the open waters of the Philippine Sea. 4 battleships, including the Yamato with her 18.1-inch guns, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, Kurita turned south along the coast of Samar, headed for Leyte Gulf. Nothing in front of him except 3 small task units of thin-skinned escort carriers that were scheduled to be conducting close air support operations for the beach at daybreak. The nearest of those task units was called Taffy 3. It was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague. At 0658, on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, a lookout on one of Sprague's escort carriers saw pagoda masts on the horizon to the north. He knew what pagoda masts meant. They meant Japanese battleships, where there was not supposed to be a Japanese battleship within 500 miles. Sprague's radioman began sending the message that would eventually reach Halsey, 400 miles to the north, chasing Ozawa's empty carriers. The message said, in clear text and not in code, that the entire center force of the Imperial Japanese Navy had emerged unopposed from the San Bernardino Strait and was steaming toward Leyte Gulf. That message would eventually produce, from Pearl Harbor, a follow-up message to Halsey that included, as random encryption padding at the end of a routine query, 4 words that Halsey would misread as a personal insult from Nimitz. World wonders. Halsey would throw his cap on the deck. He would collapse into a chair. Rear Admiral Robert Carney, his chief of staff, would tell him to stop it and to get hold of himself. Halsey would order Task Force 34 to turn south. By that time, it would be too late. Because the same morning, in the darkness before dawn, in a different strait 300 miles to the south, a 54-year-old Japanese admiral named Shoji Nishimura had already gone to meet his son. That is what happens next. Part 3. The Battle of Surigao Strait began at approximately 0230 on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, when the first American PT boat launched a torpedo at the lead destroyer of Vice Admiral Nishimura's southern force. The torpedo missed. Over the next 4 hours, 39 American PT boats would attack Nishimura's column repeatedly in the darkness of the strait. They would score almost no hits. They would lose several boats to Japanese return fire. But they would keep Rear Admiral Oldendorf waiting at the northern exit of the strait, informed of Nishimura's exact position, course, and speed throughout the night. Nishimura had no radar sophisticated enough to see the American ships attacking him. He fired back at the muzzle flashes he could see in the darkness. He kept his course. He kept his speed. He continued north. At approximately 0300, on the morning of the 25th of October, Captain Jesse G. Coward, commanding Destroyer Squadron 54, gave the order that opened the American surface counterattack. 2 words came over the tactical radio: play ball. Every destroyer captain in Coward's squadron and in the 2 squadrons following him knew exactly what those words meant. 94 American torpedoes went into the water in the next 20 minutes. Japanese destroyer Yamagumo detonated. She had been carrying depth charges and torpedo warheads. When the American torpedo struck her, she exploded in a single flash that briefly turned the darkness of the strait to daylight. All hands aboard were killed. The Japanese destroyer Michishio was struck. She lost power. She stopped dead in the water. She would sink later that morning. Japanese destroyer Asagumo had her bow blown off. She lost speed. She fell behind the formation. The Japanese battleship Fuso, second in Nishimura's column, was struck by an American torpedo on her starboard side amidships. Damage was catastrophic. Fires broke out. Ammunition began cooking off. Fuso fell out of formation. 60 years after the battle, American accounts described Fuso as having exploded and broken in 2, with both halves of the ship burning separately on the surface of the strait for hours. That description made it into the official histories. It made it into memoirs. It made it into the Naval Academy textbooks that officers who fought the next several wars had learned from. It was wrong. In 2009, in a book called Battle of Surigao Strait, the naval historian Anthony Tully challenged the traditional account. He argued, on the basis of a careful re-examination of the survivor testimonies and the wreck locations that Fuso had not broken in two. She had sunk intact. Two burning hulks that PT boat observers had seen in the darkness of the strait that morning had been two separate ships, Fuso and Yamashiro, at different positions, burning after separate torpedo hits, misidentified in the confusion of night combat as one ship broken in half. In November of 2017, the research vessel Petrel, funded by the estate of the late Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, conducted a sonar and camera survey of the seabed in Surigao Strait. Petrel located 5 Japanese warships on the bottom of the strait, all in the positions where Tully's analysis had predicted they should be. Fuso was one of them. She was found intact. She had not broken in two. The myth that had persisted in every American account of the battle for 60 years was at last retired. At approximately 0351, in the flag plot of USS West Virginia, at the northern exit of the Surigao Strait, an American gunnery officer reported that the Mark 8 fire control radar had achieved a firm solution on a large target at bearing 270 degrees, range 22,800 yards. The target was the Japanese battleship Yamashiro. The commanding officer of USS West Virginia gave the order to open fire. The 8 16-inch guns of USS West Virginia's 4 main battery turrets fired the first salvo of the last surface engagement between battleships in the history of warfare. Shells traveled 22,800 yards in approximately 30 seconds. Hit. 20 seconds later, USS California and USS Tennessee, both equipped with the same Mark 8 radar, opened fire on the same target. 20 seconds after that, USS Maryland and USS Pennsylvania and USS Mississippi added their guns to the salvos. The next 18 minutes, 6 American battleships fired approximately 285 shells at Yamashiro. Yamashiro burned from bow to stern. Her main battery turrets kept firing for a time, aiming at the muzzle flashes she could see across the water, but she had no radar, and she was hitting nothing. At approximately 0411 on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura sent his last transmission from the bridge of Yamashiro. The transmission consisted of 6 words: "We proceed till totally destroyed." That was the last message from the Southern Force. 0419, Yamashiro capsized to port and sank in the middle of the Surigao Strait. Took Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura and 2,367 of her officers and men with her. 10 men survived. 10 out of 2,377. Nishimura's body was never recovered. He is where his son Teiji has been since 1942. He is in the waters around the Philippines. At approximately 0425, 20 minutes after Yamashiro capsized, the trailing Japanese force under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima entered the southern end of the Surigao Strait. Shima saw the fires ahead of him. He saw the wreckage. He understood immediately that Nishimura's force had ceased to exist. He gave the order to reverse course. He was the only senior Japanese naval commander at Leyte Gulf who chose to withdraw rather than press an attack. In a Japanese historical interview many years after the war, Vice Admiral Shima was asked why he had turned back at Surigao when other Japanese commanders in similar situations had chosen to press the attack. He answered in one sentence. "I turned back," he said, "because it was the only thing that was right." 3 hours after Yamashiro capsized, at approximately 0658 on the morning of the 25th of October, in a different body of water 200 miles to the north, the disaster that Halsey's decision had made possible executed itself. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force emerged from the eastern end of the San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea. 4 battleships, including Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. The nearest American force was Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Sprague's escort carriers were about 1/3 the size of a fleet carrier. They had thin armor. Their main defensive armament was one 5-inch gun per ship. They had been built to provide close air support to Marines on beaches, not to fight Japanese battleships. Yamato opened fire on Sprague's task unit at approximately 35,000 yards. The 18.1-inch shells from Yamato's main battery, each weighing 3,220 pounds, are the largest naval shells ever fired in combat. They arrived on Sprague's escort carriers in salvos so large that the dye splashes from the near misses were taller than the carriers themselves. Yamato scored direct hits on the escort carrier Gambier Bay, contributing to her sinking. Yamato scored direct hits on the destroyer Johnston. The destroyer Johnston was commanded by Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, 36 years old. Ernest Evans was Cherokee and Creek by ancestry. He was the first Native American graduate of the United States Naval Academy to command a warship in combat. The commissioning of USS Johnston on the 27th of October, 1943, at Seattle, Commander Evans had told his newly assembled crew that he intended to take his ship into harm's way, and that any man who did not want to go into harm's way had better get off the ship immediately. None of them did. On the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, Commander Evans took Johnston into harm's way against Vice Admiral Kurita's center force. He turned his single destroyer, alone, into a formation of 4 Japanese battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. He fired his 5-inch guns at the pagoda mast of the battleship Yamato. He fired his torpedoes at the leading heavy cruisers of the Japanese line. One of his torpedoes struck the heavy cruiser Kumano and blew her bow off. Kumano fell out of formation. She would eventually return to Brunei with her damage. For the next 2 hours, Johnston and the destroyers USS Hull and USS Herman, and the destroyer escorts USS Samuel B. Roberts and 3 others, in the most one-sided surface action of the Pacific War, held off Kurita's center force from destroying the escort carriers behind them. Johnston took hits from Yamato's secondary batteries and from Congo's main batteries. Commander Evans was wounded. He lost the fingers of one hand. He lost the shirt off his back. He continued to command from the exposed bridge of his sinking ship. USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort of only 1,350 tons, closed to 5,300 yards from the Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai and opened fire with her single 5-inch gun. She fired that gun until the barrel ran out of powder and her coxswain Paul Henry Carr had to load it manually with the last 3 shells they had aboard. She was hit multiple times. She sank at approximately 10:05 that morning with the loss of 89 of her crew. Coxswain Paul Henry Carr was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously for continuing to load that last gun manually while mortally wounded. He died beside it. Johnston sank at approximately 09:10. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was last seen on the fantail of his ship, still giving orders as she rolled over. His body was never recovered. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. He is the first Native American to receive the Medal of Honor for United States Navy service. His body is still with his ship. His ship is at a depth of 6,469 meters in the Philippine Trench, where the research vessel Petrel located her wreck in March of 2019 at approximately 09:25 on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, with the American escort carrier still afloat, with Sprague's remaining destroyers and destroyer escorts still fighting. With Halsey's Third Fleet still hundreds of miles to the north, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita broke off the engagement and withdrew his center force back toward the San Bernardino Strait. He believed, based on the reports his ships had radioed to him during the 2-hour battle, that he had sunk multiple American fleet carriers. He had not. The actual American losses at the Battle off Samar were 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. Kurita withdrew from the battle off Samar under the impression that he had won a victory. He had missed the greatest opportunity of the Pacific War for the Imperial Japanese Navy to destroy an unprotected American landing fleet. He had missed it because he thought the battle was over based on numbers that were not real, and because he had been awake for 72 hours, and because he feared Halsey's carriers would return at any moment when in fact Halsey's carriers were 400 miles away chasing an empty decoy. The report Kurita composed that evening, aboard Yamato, retreating through the San Bernardino Strait, said that he had sunk 5 American aircraft carriers. The report was wrong. For the second time in 13 days, and for the last time in the Pacific War as an operational report of decisive consequence, the leadership of the Empire of Japan was told a version of what had happened at sea that had almost no relationship to what had actually happened. But the 25th of October, 1944, was not finished with Taffy 3. At approximately 10:47 that morning, 1 hour after Kurita's withdrawal, 5 Japanese Zero fighters appeared low on the horizon, approaching Sprague's escort carriers from the south. They were led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. They had flown 350 kilometers from Abalakat airfield. Each aircraft carried one 250-kilogram bomb attached to its fuselage. None of them intended to return. The first Zero, piloted by Lieutenant Seki, dove into the escort carrier USS St. Lo. Seki's aircraft struck the flight deck at high speed. The bomb his aircraft was carrying penetrated the flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck below, in the middle of the aviation gasoline storage area. Chain reaction of secondary explosions began immediately. USS St. Lo sank at approximately 11:25, less than 40 minutes after Seki's impact. 143 of her crew were killed. The other 4 Zeros in Seki's flight attacked and damaged 3 other escort carriers, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and White Plains. That was the first officially organized kamikaze attack in the history of warfare. It was also the first successful kamikaze sinking of a United States Navy warship. By the end of the Second World War, 10.5 months later, approximately 3,860 Japanese pilots would die in kamikaze attacks. They would sink 47 American ships and damage over 300 more. All of it began at 10:47 on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, when a 23-year-old lieutenant named Yukio Seki married 4 months to a woman named Mariko Watanabe, whom he had told a reporter the night before was the only reason he was going, put his Zero into the flight deck of an American escort carrier called USS St. Lo. Is the day that was. That is what October 25th, 1944 was. 3 battles in 3 different bodies of water over the course of about 11 hours. Surigao at dawn. Cape Engano beginning at approximately 8:30 when Halsey's aircraft first struck Ozawa's decoy carriers to the north. Samar from 6:58 in the morning through the kamikaze strikes at 10:47. By sunset on the evening of the 25th, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting force capable of offensive operations. By sunset on the evening of the 26th, mopping up on the retreat routes to Brunei and to Japan, the count would be final. That is what happened at Leyte Gulf. That is what 139 years of the age of battleships ended in. That is the end of the story, except for the aftermath. Part 4, Ozawa's decoy mission succeeded. Between the afternoon of the 25th of October and the morning of the 26th, Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet aircraft attacked Ozawa's northern force off Cape Engano and sank all 4 of Ozawa's aircraft carriers: Chitose, Chiyoda, Zuiho, and Zuikaku. Zuikaku had been one of the 6 aircraft carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941. By the time Zuikaku went down at approximately 14:14 on the afternoon of the 25th of October, 1944, her 5 sister ships from Pearl Harbor had already been sunk: Kagi and Kaga and Soryu and Hiryu at Midway in June of 1942. Shokaku by an American submarine in June of 1944 during the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Zuikaku was the last of them. When she rolled onto her port side and slipped beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, the Kido Butai, the six-carrier striking force that had begun the war against the United States ceased to exist. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa survived. He had transferred his flag off the flagship Zuikaku to a light cruiser earlier in the action. He returned to Japan. He testified after the war that he had accepted his decoy mission, knowing that his ships would probably not survive, and that he had considered the mission successful because he had drawn Halsey away from the invasion beaches. He was not wrong. Ozawa died on the 9th of November, 1966, at the age of 80. The final tally of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when it was compiled after the war and cross-checked against Japanese records, came to this. Japanese losses: 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 12 destroyers, approximately 12,500 sailors killed, 28 warships sunk in 4 days, American losses. 1 fleet carrier, USS Princeton, bombed by a single Japanese aircraft on the morning of the 24th of October and sunk that afternoon. 2 escort carriers, USS Gambier Bay from Yamato's guns off Samar and USS St. Lo from Lieutenant Seki's kamikaze. 2 destroyers, USS Hull and USS Johnston from the battle off Samar. 1 destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts. Approximately 1,500 American sailors killed. 6 ships sunk to 28. 1,500 dead to 12,500. That is the arithmetic of the largest naval battle in the history of the world. The Imperial Japanese Navy that emerged from the Battle of Leyte Gulf, still in existence on paper, retained a handful of battleships, some cruisers, and a few dozen destroyers. It had almost no aircraft. It had almost no trained pilots. It had almost no fuel oil. It would launch one more offensive operation in April of 1945, when the super battleship Yamato was sent on a suicide mission to Okinawa and sunk by American carrier aircraft before she came within 150 miles of her destination. Otherwise, it did nothing. By August of 1945, when the war ended, most of the surviving Japanese warships were rusting at their moorings in the home islands, out of fuel to move. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, who had gone into the Surigao Strait knowing he would not come out, has been remembered in post-war Japan as one of the tragic figures of the Pacific War. His name is inscribed at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. His son, Teiji Nishimura, killed in the Philippines in 1942, is inscribed there as well. They are inscribed a few lines apart. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who withdrew from the battle off Samar at 0925 on the morning of the 25th of October, when he had an open path to the American landing beaches, spent the rest of his life defending that decision. He gave a series of interviews to Japanese historians and to American historians and to his own family. He offered multiple explanations. He said he had been afraid of another air attack. He said his reports had told him he had won a victory. He said he had wanted to preserve his surviving ships for future operations. He said he had been exhausted. None of the explanations completely satisfied anybody. Kurita retired from the Japanese Navy after the war. He lived quietly in Japan. He died on the 19th of December, 1977, at the age of 88. He is the officer who came closer than any other Japanese commander to destroying an American landing fleet during the Pacific War, and who then, for reasons that historians have debated for 80 years, turned around and went home. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had proposed the kamikaze attacks in the meeting at Nichols Field on the evening of the 19th of October, 1944, sent approximately 3,860 young Japanese men to their deaths in kamikaze attacks between October of 1944 and August of 1945. On the night of the 15th of August, 1945, hours after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, Vice Admiral Onishi returned to his official residence in Tokyo, sat down at his desk, wrote a suicide note, and committed seppuku. The note apologized to the spirits of the fallen kamikaze pilots for having sent them to their deaths. Onishi cut his own abdomen open in the traditional formula. He refused to allow the traditional second, the kaishakunin, to strike off his head to end the suffering. He died approximately 15 hours later, in the afternoon of the 16th of August, 1945. He was 54 years old. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who had flown his Zero into USS St. Lo on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, was survived by his wife Mariko Watanabe. She was 21 years old on the day her husband died. She never remarried. She lived a private life in Ehime Prefecture and gave few interviews. In the interviews she did give, she said what her husband had told the reporter Koji Ono on the night before his mission. He had not died for the emperor. He had not died for the empire. He had done what he had done because he had been ordered to do it, and because, in the world he had found himself in, doing it was the only way he knew how to protect the person he loved. Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague, who had commanded Taffy 3 off Samar on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, and whose task unit had held off Kurita's center force for 2 hours until Kurita had inexplicably turned around, was promoted to Vice Admiral after the war. He retired in 1951. He died on the 11th of April, 1955, at Naval Hospital Balboa in San Diego, California, at the age of 59, of a heart condition brought on, his doctors said, by the accumulated stress of 35 years of naval service. He is buried at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, overlooking the entrance to San Diego Bay. Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf, who had executed the last successful crossing of the T in the history of naval warfare in Surigao Strait, continued in Pacific operations through the end of the war. He was wounded at Lingayen Gulf in January of 1945. He recovered. He retired in 1948 at the rank of admiral. He died on the 27th of April, 1974, in Portsmouth, Virginia, at the age of 87. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr., whose decision to take his entire Third Fleet north on the evening of the 24th of October left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded and gave Kurita's center force its opportunity to reach Taffy 3, spent the rest of his life defending that decision. He wrote a memoir in 1947 called Admiral Halsey's Story. He argued that destroying Japanese carrier capability had been the strategic priority and that the battle off Samar had been a tactical price worth paying for that strategic victory. Samuel Eliot Morison, in the 12th volume of his official history of United States naval operations in the Second World War, published in 1958, disagreed. Morison called the decision a mistake. Morison argued that Kurita's center force, with the super battleship Yamato at its head, had been the greater strategic threat, and that Halsey's decision to leave the San Bernardino Strait unguarded had come within 90 minutes of producing the destruction of the American landing fleet at Leyte. The debate between the two positions has continued in the naval history profession for 80 years. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, whose 7th Fleet had borne the consequences of Halsey's decision and whose desperate messages to Halsey on the morning of the 25th of October had produced the world wonders reply from Nimitz, never publicly forgave Halsey. Kinkaid and Halsey did not speak to each other from October of 1944 until Halsey's death in 1959. Kinkaid did not attend Halsey's funeral. Admiral William Halsey is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. They lie approximately 600 yards apart in separate sections facing different directions. The decision that produced that 15-year silence is still taught at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, as the definitive case study in the American naval history literature on the specific failure mode called Unity of Command. The destroyer that Commander Ernest Evans had turned into the entire Japanese center force at 0710 on the morning of the 25th of October was located on the 30th of March, 2019 by the research vessel Petrel. She was found at a depth of 6,469 meters in the Philippine Trench off the coast of Samar. At the time of her discovery, She was the deepest shipwreck ever located on planet Earth, USS Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, whose coxswain Paul Henry Carr had died loading the last shells into a broken 5-inch gun, was located on the 22nd of June, 2022 by an expedition led by Victor Vescovo aboard the submersible Limiting Factor. She was found at a depth of 6,895 meters in the Philippine Sea. She is, as of the time of this recording, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered on Earth. Both ships are intact. They rest upright on the abyssal plain. Naval historians who have viewed the footage of the surveys have described them as looking as if their crews had left only moments before. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans is still with his ship. He is at a depth of 6,469 meters in the Philippine Trench. His grave is deeper than any grave that any American serviceman has ever been given. In the years since the discovery of the two wrecks, both Johnston and Samuel B. Roberts have been designated protected United States Navy war graves. The Bell of Samuel B. Roberts was recovered during the 2022 expedition and is now displayed at the United States Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis, Maryland. Nothing has been recovered from Johnston. She is left, by policy and by respect, exactly where she is. Samuel Eliot Morison, in the final volume of his History of United States Naval Operations in the Second World War, wrote a sentence about the Battle of Surigao Strait that has been quoted at every commissioning of every American surface combatant since its publication. Never again, Morison wrote, will battleships fight battleships. The age that began at Trafalgar in 1805 ended in Surigao Strait in 1944. It lasted 139 years. It ended in 18 minutes. Between the 23rd and the 26th of October, 1944, in the waters around a Philippine island called Leyte, 200,000 men from two navies fought the largest naval battle in the history of the world. 67 Japanese warships attacked 300 American warships across a distance of 800 kilometers. 28 Japanese ships went to the bottom. 6 American ships went with them. 12,500 Japanese sailors died. 1,500 Americans died. Admiral Nishimura went to the bottom of Surigao Strait with 2,367 of his crew, still carrying the memory of his son Teiji, who had died in the Philippines 2 years earlier. Commander Ernest Evans, Cherokee Creek warrior from Pawnee, went down with USS Johnston at 0910 on the morning of the 25th of October, giving orders from his stern as his ship rolled over. His body is still with his ship at a depth of 6,469 meters. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, 23 years old, married 4 months, crashed his Zero into USS St. Lo at 10:47 that same morning. In doing so, he opened the era of kamikaze warfare that would kill 3,860 more young Japanese men in the 10.5 months of the war that remained. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita withdrew his center force at 0925 that morning, based on wrong reports his own ships had sent him. In that withdrawal, he saved the American landing force at Leyte and ended the offensive power of the Imperial Japanese Navy forever. Admiral William Halsey chased a decoy fleet 400 miles north and left the door open for Kurita. His decision has been debated by naval officers for 80 years since. He is buried 600 yards from the man who never forgave him, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had proposed the kamikaze attacks on the evening of the 19th of October, killed himself in his own home 15 hours after the Emperor's surrender broadcast, cutting his own abdomen and refusing to let the traditional second end his suffering. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague survived Samar and died 10 years later of a heart brought down by the war. Samuel Eliot Morison wrote in 1958 that the age of battleship warfare that began at Trafalgar in 1805 ended in Surigao Strait in 1944. 139 years. Ended in 18 minutes. If your father, your uncle, Your grandfather stood on the deck of any American ship in the waters around Leyte on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944. USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, USS Pennsylvania, USS Mississippi, USS Johnston, USS Hull, USS Heermann, USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, USS Raymond, USS Gambier Bay, USS Kalinin Bay, USS Kitgun Bay, USS White Plains, USS Fanshawe Bay. Any of the 300 American ships that fought at Leyte Gulf in the 4 days between the 23rd and the 26th of October, 1944. He came home a witness to something that no one will ever see again in the history of naval warfare on this planet. Because the age that began at Trafalgar ended at Surigao Strait. Because the age that began at Salamis in 480 BC ended in the 18 minutes between 3:53 and 4:11 on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944. Because after Leyte Gulf, naval combat between capital ships became a chapter that had closed. If you have a name that belongs on this story, an ancestor who was there, a photograph in a shoebox in an attic, a grave in a cemetery in a small American town with a small American flag beside it, please leave the name in the comments below this video. Because the men who were at Leyte Gulf are almost all gone now. The youngest of them, if any survive, are approaching 100 years of age. Within the next few years, all of them will be gone.